Jormningsson. Yeah, this is going to be kind of fast and furious. Chris and I were just kind of figuring out on the fly how to get all of our stuff into this time. So, yeah, fast and furious. I apologize for that, but I'm happy to talk about things afterwards. So we'll try to be coherent as I speak. Video games are not games. A little bit about me. I make games and stuff, etc. Enough about me. The title of my talk is Video Games Are Not Games. Okay, Danger Ranger, where am I going with this, right? Well, we all know the context of a claim like this, right? Which is that we tend to use the word video game and game interchangeably. We've been doing this for a long time, right? We can find lots and lots of examples like this. We all do this all the time. Right? And this is hardly surprising because we tend to talk about video games predominantly in the context of games and as being a subset of a game, as being a new kind of game. Right? But I think there's a problem with this framing, and I think it's a big enough problem that it deserves discussion even in 2018, even at IndieCade. And I say even in 2018, even at IndieCade, because I suspect some of you are probably wary about where I'm going with this, right? This kind of smacks of old conversations, old debates, things about what makes a legitimate game that I think we probably don't necessarily feel a need to go back to, right? We don't probably want to feel like returning to some kind of dark age where people were like, that's not a game, it's a walking simulator. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is that I'm not interested in going back there, right? I'm not a language purist, and the question of how we frame video games is not about dictionary definitions to me. I care about the question of how we frame video games because I'm a game maker, and there I just used the word game interchangeably with video game, and I'm a pragmatist. I care about this stuff because I think the way we frame video games ends up affecting how we look to understand and appreciate video games, how we teach people to make video games, and the kinds of video games that we end up making. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this in a moment. But first, let's back up for a minute and consider this framing. Okay, so why is this maybe a not so great way to think about video games? And that's a rhetorical question because we're at IndieCade. We know the answer to this, which is that we've made a whole bunch of video games that don't really fit neatly in the circle, right? I don't think I need to list those games. I think we're aware of them. So what do we do with these oddball video games? Well, maybe we adjust our model to look a little bit more like this, right? And now our oddball video games can exist comfortably in the sliver down here. And this is often, I think, about as far as we get. And I do think this model is a bit better than the other one, but it still doesn't really work for me. And the problem with this is that even if I think of video games that are very gamey, games that are very much in this sort of part of the circle, right, there are all kinds of things about those video games that I appreciate which don't really have anything to do with them being games one way or another, right? Complex and significant aspects of these video games that feel like they deserve a lot more love and attention, right, than being classified as a not gamey part of a mostly gamey thing. Right, so let me briefly give some examples of what I'm talking about, reasons we appreciate games that aren't about gameplay, and this isn't rocket science, right, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but one of the most obvious, right, we appreciate video games for telling stories. Okay, and storytelling is this whole huge complex thing, right? It's not some little part of games, right? And in fact, a lot of people have pointed out the fact that, traditional games historically haven't necessarily been very good or very concerned with telling stories one way or the other. Another example, we appreciate games for being digital and computational, right? For being written in code, making use of the power of CPUs and GPUs to generate complex worlds, procedural worlds, interesting AI, stunning 3D graphics, etc., right? But none of these things necessitate or are inherent to the traditional notion of games, which of course were around for thousands of years before the first microprocessor was invented, right? And And the final example of why we appreciate video games for being outside of gameplay, right, is for being interactive and nonlinear. And so this is a little different, right, because some people will say, yes, right, this is the thing. This is what is unique to video games. Unlike storytelling and computation are fine, but here this is what's unique. Right, the core of games, interaction is what makes video games interesting, unique, and this is why we should look at video games in relation, as games primarily. Right, and I would say that traditional games certainly are interactive. Right, no one's going to debate that. But importantly, there are all kinds of examples of interactive, nonlinear media that form part of the heritage of video games, which are not games. Things like the I Ching, or this ancient Chinese poem that can be read 40,000 different ways, or interactive art installations, or the Eliza chatbot, or the parable of the polygons. Right. So my point is that interactive media has its own unique history that overlaps with, right, but is not identical to the history of games or video games. Right, so I think these various aspects of video games, the storytelling potential, computational dimension, their connection to various forms of interactive media, to name just a few things, right, are each more complex in their own right than a model like this allows. Right, and a model like this, where I think we end up needing to stick way too much stuff down in this little sliver down there. So I think a better way to frame video games is as a complex category that involves the overlap of many other complex categories, none of which have hard boundaries. So, if you think of games, right? So many video games do, of course, overlap strongly with the concept of game. Others don't so much, right? Or we think of narrative, storytelling, narrative machines. Again, many video games overlap strongly with this. For others, Tetris, etc., right, it's a stretch. Right, and most video games overlap with concepts of digital, interactive, computational, and nonlinear media. Right, but again, these categories are not all the same thing. Right, not all digital media is interactive, not all or computational. Not all interactive media is nonlinear or digital. Each of these categories is actually vast and varied in its own right, and so are video games. And these named categories and concepts are still not any kind of full picture, right, of what video games are. I think there are many other circles we could add to this cloud, get around to a couple of those, but I think there's a lot more that can go in here. Right, so notice the difference of relation to the category of game in this framing and in this framing. Okay, but enough diagrams. Very quickly, why does any of this matter? Right, why does it matter if we frame video games like this or like this? Okay, so, well, as I've already hinted at, I mentioned at the beginning, I think it matters broadly for these reasons, right? It affects how we look to understand and appreciate games, how we teach people to make video games, and the kinds of games we end up making. Right, so in terms of the first point, let's go back to video games telling stories. What's important here is that people will use framing to apply inverse logic. Okay, so that's something we humans do all the time. Okay, so here's the example of inverse logic. Okay, A, video games are a type of game. B, games don't do storytelling well. What could C be? Therefore C, video games couldn't possibly do storytelling well, and therefore D, nobody should waste their time trying to tell stories with video games. Right, and so we get into this debate of whether video games can and should tell stories when we have all kinds of examples in front of our faces of video games telling great stories. Right? They just often don't look very much like traditional games when they're doing it, right? And I would say that's because they aren't games. They're a new medium that can do gameplay, and they can do storytelling, and they can do various combinations of gameplay and storytelling, right? And this seems like a very simple realization, but it's often one that can be surprisingly hard to make if we insist on thinking of video games as a new type of game. Or if we go back to digital and computational media, the nature of video games. Okay, this again, I'm gonna have to speed through some of this stuff. I think we get digital and computational media, right? Procedurality, 3D renderings, right? Like, I mean, we certainly wouldn't have Minecraft, we wouldn't have Tetris, we wouldn't have any video game without the computation that underlies it, right? And the procedures and all the kinds of things you can do with a CPU. And again, it's like if we frame video games, it's amazing how, right, we can do a lot of talking about with video games about what makes something a fun, interactive experience without ever actually talking about computation, right? And I think we do this far too often with video games, as if video games aren't as related to the broad category of computational media just as much as they're related to things like checkers or baseball. And these are just a couple of broad examples of how the framing impacts how we approach video games. Right? If we look at one specific example very quickly, if you look at something like Passage, right, a classic sort of oddball video game, right, and we all know the stereotypical gamer reaction to Passage, right, with some combination of anger and frustration, perplexity, right, and the main thing that's leveled against it, that's not a game, right, and this is intentionally an old example, right, and people have sort of become more accepting in general. But even if we work to appreciate something like Passage as a game, right, I would say that doesn't help us understand why we appreciate it, right? Because it's certainly not about, we don't appreciate it for its fun, balanced gameplay, right? That's sure, it's like not why we appreciate Passage, right? So I think a helpful answer to gamers who don't find Passage interesting as a game is not to defend it as a game, which is a conversation that goes nowhere, right? You're dumb. No, you're dumb. No, you're dumb. No, you're dumb. Right, but instead explain why it can still be an interesting and valid video game without having to be a game or to operate like a traditional game. So if we look at Passage like this, we get more interesting, we can find more interesting things to say. Okay, teach people to make video games. Okay, so if we teach people to make video games, how do we teach people to make video games? Well, as a new kind of game, most of our textbooks, right, frame video games as a new kind of game, right? So you learn video game design by learning game design, right? So you have something like the MDA framework, right? It can be equally well applied to digital games or to analog games, right? Because it's a game design framework. That's what it is, right? Rules of play. It states very clearly in the preface, right? It's a book about game design, not et cetera, more things. They're all game design, right? Video games as games. This is how we teach game design. Right, so we miss potentially a lot of valid starting points, entry points, other ways to approach video games that are not games. And the last thing, the kinds of video games we end up making. This was me back in 2009. I made some kind of crazy games, and it was helpful to be part of this when I was doing this, the Not Games forum with Tale of Tales and the Not Games Manifesto. Does anyone remember this stuff, know this stuff? Okay, cool. Yes, Chris, awesome. Right, so there's this whole thing, not games, and I think that framing was important, thinking about games, video games being not games, for me, making some of the stuff that I wouldn't have made otherwise, right? Because it really freed me to do that. And there are a lot of developers who were active here that we could talk about and the stuff they made, right, that might not have been made otherwise. Yeah, and I think just like with making video games, right, when it comes to framing video games, I don't think there's any such thing as a rival. I think we need to keep talking about video games and reframing them just as much as we need to keep making them, because the two endeavors feed into each other. And so just a final anecdote, and I'll wrap it up in 30 seconds here. One of my most recent projects, right, was this series of contemplative religious artifacts games I call Stations of the Cross. And even with all the crazy stuff I've made in the past, I don't think I could have made this even a few years ago when my framing for video games was more like this than it was like this, right? This framing allowed me to add sort of this circle and think about what I was doing in a way that I might have neglected otherwise. This says ritual objects down there, by the way. And yeah, so ultimately, the end. I don't think we can or should stop calling video games games, but I do think we need to consciously, critically consider how that framing, the implications of that, even as we continue to use those words, right? Because I think it's worth, and I think it's worth reminding ourselves of this stuff even now, even if we're crazy avant-garde game makers or whatever. Thank you very much. That's the end of my talk. Yeah.
You mind picking this up?
Yeah.
Sweet. All right. Okay, what I'm coming to this from is that games are made of rules, digital games are not. That game obstacles and actions are artificial, digital game obstacles and actions are not. Now, obviously, the framing narrative fiction is artificial. Those aren't real witches, aren't real dragons, aren't real princesses, but the obstacles are physical and real, as we'll be talking about. And so for starters, when you want to play a board game, it's fundamentally a pile of cardboard and paper, and you have to read the rules understand the instructions in order to play, to have any idea how to meaningfully manipulate these objects. It's equally true with the basketball, and it's equally true with newer examples like Pandemic, etc. But if we just, for a moment, separate ourselves from board games, card games, and so on, let's say we put tape on the floor, and we're going to make a game out of this. I'm going to say, don't step over the blue tape. You have 35 seconds. If you get from this part to that part without going around outside, I see you, then I'm going to give you a prize. And we have to define these rules because you are capable of stepping over the tape. Because you're capable of arguing, actually it was 31 seconds, which is under 35 when I counted it differently, and this is why we need those rules. And in fact, playing games, arguing over rules is a fundamental part of how we negotiate baseball or sometimes even Monopoly as to, is this valid in the interpretation of the rules that we have? Now, if we contrast this to a situation where instead of a tape maze on the floor, you're in the airport at B5, in 30 minutes, your flight takes off from C18, and if you don't get there in time, the plane is gone. I don't have to give you rules like don't go through people or don't go through the walls. You physically can't do it, so it's irrelevant. You don't even ask the question. And so these are slightly different despite the fact both fundamentally being a timed maze situation. When you get to the end, if the flight took off, it's not out of respect for the rules that you don't board the flight. It's because the plane is gone and you missed your chance. Now, if we look at chess, which one of these is more like? We mentally frame this as a very structured game, but in fact, if you look carefully, you can actually huddle all the pieces on one tile. You can roll the pieces around. You can put one between four tiles. You can do all kinds of shenanigans that make no sense in chess. The walls here are closer to the tape maze. In contrast to Pac-Man, these walls are stronger than the drywall in an airport. You cannot push the joystick hard enough to power Pac-Man through that wall. It is a physical constraint. And I do mean physical, but it's easiest to look at in the older games like Pong, where to make this number go up, this ball has to get off that side. I can't cheat and fudge the number. If I'm just trying to be tricky, I have to make it do that. And what's really going on under the hood, this is an old enough game, it was not programmed, it was on chips on a board, is there's a literal flow of electricity that we can picture that until I can sort of fiddle with the control input handle dials, until I can achieve a certain flow of electricity, then I'm not going to increment my score number to a higher value. And this way the games are a little bit more like these puzzles you buy from the junk area in Cracker Barrel, where you're pushing and shoving and jamming, physically whatever you can do. Now there's still a basic rule, don't use a blowtorch, don't smash it with a chisel. But as long as you understand your objective is get the ring off, you kind of do whatever you can do with it within your musculature and your basic common sense. Spoiler alert, it's not a brute force game. That's how that works. Now with Pong, obviously, it's play with the dials. If you're back there with a soldering iron, that's probably not fair. Similarly, from pinball forward, it's been mediated through a button. And this makes a huge difference to how we negotiate these games, because instead of being, I could do anything with these pieces, if you can't do a thing in a game, if you can't fire right now because you're reloading, it won't let you fire. If you can't block because you're in the middle of an uppercut, it won't let you block. The game is doing that for us, so we don't have to internalize first how and when I'm allowed to do these things. And underneath the hood of these games is a 1.5 mile wire, which dictates the cause and effect relationship. You can play these games for years without having fully internalized when and why certain lights should be on, when and why you actually get multi-ball. Sometimes it just happens and the machine goes nuts. And this is a very different experience than a board game where for it to happen, I have to have seen it, known it, and declared, okay, I have gotten 3 yellows, it's multi-ball time. This is important in part because we can actually implement other games mechanically through these sort of enforcement systems, which, through experimenting with it, you might play this classic Playboy, no association with the other one, and figure out from it what does a card of hands count as? Which of these are better scored, and so on. This is important to Michael Liebe's research, which has to do with the fact that with digital solitaire, you can fiddle with this, as I did as a child, and learn how to play solitaire. I can't give you a deck of cards and say, go figure out solitaire. I can give you this, and in a way, solitaire is a microscopic universe in which the laws of physics are written in such a way that the only valid physical maneuvers are consistent with one-to-one mapping of obeying the rules in the real world. Jesper Juhl's research in Half Real talked about how if we look at soccer rules, we dictate things like what players can do. Don't touch it with your hands. Playfield dimensions, ball weight, ball pressure. Not soccer rules, air resistance, grass condition, human anatomy. There's no rule that says don't run 90 miles an hour. Your body can't do it, so there doesn't have to be a rule. There's no rule that says the ball should slow down gradually. Now, in Jesper Juhl's research, he discussed the idea that perhaps when we make digital FIFA, we take the physical laws and we turn them into rules. My argument is that the opposite is happening. We're taking what were rules enforced by a referee and making them as real as the air resistance of the human anatomy. My point counts for 2, not because the referee saw it, but for the exact same deterministic physical systems as the reason my character runs at a certain speed. In Carl Sagan terms, if you want to play soccer, you first must invent the universe within which to play soccer. If we go back to the airport, even though I said there's not really rules, don't go through walls, there are. They're called laws, and if you damage property or hurt people to achieve your objective, a referee may catch you. A referee may call you on the rule violation, and they will tackle you or shoot you in the back in America. And now the reason why this is important is because categorically, this draws the difference between laws and nature, like physics or anatomy, and computer rules on one side of categories, and on the other, Non-digital computer rules are actually closer to laws of society and place in legislature. And what this means, these are all way super wordy, players have to explicitly learn the rules and consciously obey them to avoid disallowed actions. There's no touch the soccer ball with my hand button in FIFA. It doesn't come up. It's possible for a player to violate rule by accident or strategic intention. I can cheat in all kinds of non-digital games, like they looked away from the chessboard, so I just slid the knight, hope they don't catch me. Much harder in digital chess. We'll talk about how in a minute. Rule definition and rule violation must be at a pace and fidelity fully knowable and detectable by human perception and attention. What on earth does that mean? It's a point made by Chris Crawford 35 years ago in his computer game book. And what it means is that in order to play a sport or a board game, there have to be so few rules of such crude and terrible precision that a human judge at human perception frame rate can tell the ball did or didn't cross the line. It was or wasn't within 60 seconds. Whereas in digital space, thousands of calculations happen 60 times a second that can make outcomes mechanically deterministic about distance from the epicenter of an explosion, down to the millisecond when we let go of the jump button. Players of the game can enumerate the rules well enough for someone else to recreate it. If I sit you at a table with a deck of cards and someone that knows how to play poker, everyone there can find out how to play poker. If they couldn't, you wouldn't be able to play poker in the first place. But you could play a shmup for years and know that if I move in a crazy 8 and keep shooting, I get to the boss. You have never had to internalize how or why the enemies move the way they do, what power-ups spawn when and why, how fast shots go, which you know is your relationship to the machine, and the machine worries about the details. This is important because for decades, a central genre in our industry has been platformers, and what differentiates a spy from a vampire killer from a ninja from a robot is these very subtle nuances of how the physics are implemented for air control. For what happens when you let go of a jump button in midair and a projectile hits you to get knocked backwards, fall down, or go forward. These are not fundamentally questions about what is the outcome of A touching B. They're about the structural foundation of how we craft physics in those universes that feel certain ways. This is also why, as an author in practice, when we make high-speed games, we can't necessarily play anything out through spreadsheets or know exactly what it's going to feel. In pinball, they do whitewooding, which, pun, before they paint themselves in a corner, by painting stuff on the playfield, they have a white playfield to mess with it, drill some holes, move a ramp. Mess with it, drill some holes, move a bumper. This is closer to in real-time action games, why instead of paper prototyping them, more often than not, we're thrashing on the machine and whatever we're fast with. I'm going to end by saying that all games have the same rules. I love this one because it upsets some people. And by the way, meta rules like don't use Nest or disqualified, or if you use this glitch, it doesn't count for your time run. Those are meta rules, typically. Fundamentally, 1, use standard input and direct the RAM saves. Don't use save hacks. Don't use Game Genie. We're watching. That's not fair. Don't alter hardware against soldering irons. You've all seen King of Kong. Player credit is the person playing, like cheating your SATs if someone else plays it for you. Obviously, that's not fair. If a 2-player or more game, unless you're playing Button, a classic IndieCade finalist, I believe, don't disturb other players playing outside the game. Don't block their vision. Don't tickle them. Don't yank their controller out. Don't, tell them jokes to distract them. And lastly, software must be in its officially released condition, or if modded, then known, the same for all players. Things like wall hacks in multiplayer games, obviously not fair game. But that's it. We're out of time. Thanks for coming today. Yay! We're happy to talk about it outside the room. We got the next thing to happen.